Okay, good evening and welcome to session number 5 of 6 sessions in the spring 2022 course on modern monetary theory, sponsored by the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City and presented online. Um, Today, we will move at a fairly rapid pace through chapters 5 and 6 of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. I acknowledge in advance that these will be somewhat tough going because the material is, particularly in chapter 5, continues on the what I described last week as the wonky trend uh, in Stephanie's book, and so uh, we won't expect you to grasp all of the points that she's making, or even be able to answer all of the discussion questions tonight. But this is the sort of thing where we go through, we introduce the material to you, or actually, presumably, you have introduced the material to yourself by doing the reading, and then you're you're free to go back and learn it in depth at any point in the future. So these two chapters are number 5, Winning at Trade, and number 6, You're Entitled. However, in my introductory remarks this week, I'm actually going to turn back to the bonus question that we dealt with in week 4. That question referred you to 2 media articles reporting on President Biden's May 4th remarks on what he argued are the highlights of his administration's current macroeconomic policy. The bonus question last week then asked you to evaluate Biden's remarks from the MMT perspective. I decided that if I wanted to understand Biden's thinking better, I should go straight to the source, the official White House transcript of remarks by President Biden on economic growth, jobs, and deficit reduction. I'm just going to take a minute and I'm going to put the URL for those remarks in the Slack channel. Okay, so not necessarily right now, but you are free to go back and read those remarks in full. So I'm going to cite him directly and then evaluate his statements in the way that I think MMT advocates like Stephanie Kelton would. So on May 4th, President Biden said, "We're on track to cut the federal deficit by ellipsis another 1.5 trillion by the end of this fiscal year, the biggest decline in a single year ever in American history, and the biggest decline on top of us having a $350 billion drop in the deficit last year, my first year as president." End of quote. Now, this is Keenan speaking. Biden is boasting about cutting the deficit. MMT would ask, is this something we should necessarily be boasting about? If the converse were true, that is, if the deficit were growing, would that be something we should be worried about? Biden is explicitly assuming the validity of what Abba Lerner characterized as the, quote, sound finance, end quote, approach to the federal government, as counterposed to the functional finance approach, which Abba Lerner took and which MMT advocates. Biden is implicitly assuming that the federal budget, the budget of a currency issuing level of government, works the same way as any currency using household's budget.
Right.
He is further assuming that the size of the federal budget deficit is a policy goal that can be targeted and should be targeted. MMT argues that the overall well-being of the economy is what should be targeted, and that the size of the federal deficit cannot be effectively targeted because it is determined largely by the flows of automatic stabilizers, such as tax receipts and unemployment benefits, over which the government does not have tight control. President Biden, once again. For the first time since 2016, the Treasury Department is planning to pay down the national debt issued to the public this quarter. End quote. Biden might as well be saying, for the first time since 2016, we're causing the net financial assets held by the non-government sector of our economy to go down. What happened when the Clinton administration started to pay down the national debt in the late 1990s? Once again, President Biden. Bringing down the deficit is one way to ease inflationary pressures in an economy where a consequence of a war and gas prices and oil and food and it's just a different world right this moment because of Ukraine and Russia. We reduce federal borrowing and we help combat inflation. End of quote. Hey, Joe, can you tell us specifically how reducing the deficit eases inflationary pressures? For the sake of argument, let's assume that U.S. support for one side in the Russia-Ukraine war is a good thing. How is the deficit going to go down if war spending is increasing? If that war is reducing worldwide supplies of oil and wheat, why would we expect the prices of those two key commodities to go down? Can you show us a war during which prices went down?
Yeah.
President Biden, once again. The previous administration increased the deficit every year it was in office, in part because of its reckless $2 trillion tax cut. I know you're tired of hearing me saying that, but a $2 trillion tax cut that was not paid for, and a tax cut that largely benefited the biggest corporations, 55 of which earned $40 billion in profits and paid not a single penny in income tax in 2020. And wealthiest Americans, like the billionaires who on average pay just 8% in federal taxes. End of quote. Okay, Joe, we're with you on the inequality in the tax burden. Would that the Democrats had been doing something about that during, say, the Obama administration, in which you were the number 2 guy. But hey, Joe, what exactly do you mean when you say that the Trump tax cuts were not paid for? That term, pay for, has a specific meaning in the U.S. Congress. It means that any new federal spending program cannot be implemented unless it is, quote, paid for, end of quote, by some combination of new tax revenues and spending cuts elsewhere. In this framework, the Trump tax cuts should have been paid for via spending cuts elsewhere in the federal budget. Where should those cuts have been made? President Biden, once again. Looking ahead, I have a plan to reduce the deficit even more, which will help reduce inflationary pressures and lower everyone's costs for families. Most importantly, no one making less than $400,000 will pay a penny more in federal taxes. End of quote. So, once again, Mr. President, how exactly will reducing the federal budget deficit, even assuming that you can set that as a policy goal, reduce inflationary pressures? MMT argues that any form of spending, consumer, investment, or government, where real productive resources are in short supply, will push prices up. What are the kinds of goods and services whose prices are currently being pushed up by government spending? If the prices of some goods and services are currently being pushed up by excessive consumer spending, how will taxes only on the very rich alleviate those pressures? Biden, once again. You've heard me say it before. I'm a capitalist. I believe you should be able to make as much as you legally can, but just pay your fair share. End of quote. Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, and other MMTers always say that before we can propose macroeconomic policies informed by modern money theory, we first have to articulate our social and political values. I'll give you credit, Mr. President. You have just now articulated your political values very clearly. Now, if I had more time, I could go on to the balance of President Biden's May 4th remarks and point out some areas of agreement where I and MMT would not necessarily be taking him to task. But I'll leave that for as an exercise for you. Now we're going to go back to our regularly scheduled program, and let's get back to chapters 5 and 6 in Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth.
Jim, before we go there, can I ask the question about economic growth? It seems as if, again, economic growth is considered to be a good thing, even in the face of environmental issues, etc. So that too is a question that needs considering, it seems to me. It's not necessarily a good thing to grow the economy.
It is a question, but a lot depends upon your own political and social values. As I mentioned before we began this session, in next week's session, where we cover chapters 7 and 8 of the deficit myth, we will have finally explored all the deficit myths and there proceed to the sort of discussion of values that Stephanie Kelton articulates and the policies that she articulates on that basis. MMT does not attempt to address every macroeconomic question. And so there is no one true canonical MMT position on economic growth. It's really, even in sort of the narrowest economic sense, it's somewhat outside the scope of MMT per se. You have to study other parts of macroeconomics. So I'm basically going to tell you, no, I'm not going to answer that question because it's out of scope, at least for this week.
No, I understand. Thank you.
Okay. So once again, I'll just start going through the Zoom window and start to ask you some of the questions that were posted in advance on my website and in the Slack channel. So we begin by asking people to explain some terminology that Stephanie Kelton uses in chapter 5. First term is structural reform. Ruth Kanu, can you identify what structural reform is? Please unmute.
Okay. I think I can. When a country can't devalue its currency to make it more competitive in world trade, like maybe from the Eurozone, a country might decide to take the money from labor by weakening unions and wages and pensions. It's a kind of devaluation that attacks labor, I would say. Structural reform.
Yes, that is correct. It's someone is unmuted. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes, that is correct. If you go to page 135, you'll see that Stephanie discusses structural reform as a euphemism, which orthodox economists, particularly those associated with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, use for what has also been called an internal devaluation of the economy. And as you're correct, it usually means attacking labor. Next terminology is the gold standard. Lucas, can you identify what the gold standard is?
Good day, James. Yes, the gold standard has been banded a couple of times along the way, but it was in vogue until Mr. Nixon ended it in the 70s there. But the dollar was convertible. The American dollar was convertible to gold at a fixed price for an extended period.
Okay. A bit more precise, we would say that in the period from the end of World War II to Nixon's actions in 1971 and 73, the world was most of the world was on what you would call a gold dollar exchange standard, in which other countries could exchange their dollars for gold, but U.S. citizens and nationals could not exchange, currency for gold, which was somewhat of a modification of this type of gold standard that would have applied, say, in the U.S. after 1896 and in the England in the Victorian period. Next term, currency peg. Marty Rowland, can you identify currency peg?
Yeah, the currency peg. It's an institutional arrangement used in the Bretton Woods system, for example, of actively governing conditions of trade among countries like tariffs, capital controls, to keep the flows stable and economies insulated. When the Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, the so-called religion of free trade took over. The tariffs and the capital costs relaxed under trade liberalization. Investors would discipline economics or economies. So the key idea is that a currency peg is used for fiscal austerity, high interest rates, to raise the value of the currency and increase investors.
Can I ask, what is the peg in a currency peg?
Well, the peg is the linkage between one currency to another, like the U.S. dollar.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was really getting at, was just the strict definition of currency peg.
Okay.
Because currency pegs could occur in a number of different currency regimes. So I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with the term if you see it in the financial press. Next term would be competitive devaluation. James Frederickson, can you take on that?
According to my understanding, it's the weakening of one's currency in order to improve the competitiveness in the trade arena.
That is correct.
Yep.
Thank you. I should mention that the terms that I'm asking you to define are found, for example, gold standard, page 139, currency peg 145, competitive valuation 141. And we actually come once again to the question of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Stephanie, keeps coming back to this concept. Ed Dodson, can you describe what it means by the spectrum of monetary sovereignty?
I would say it is the range in the degree of the level of monetary sovereignty a nation has and its ability to issue currency in payment of all its obligations, both domestic and external.
Okay. That is correct. If you want to check back to pages 142 and forward, you'll find additional discussion there. Okay. Explain Stephanie Kelton's contention that the U.S. benefits from a surplus of goods and services, which is the logical corollary of its trade deficit. Kuba, can I ask you to take a stab at that?
I unfortunately will have to pass on that question. I apologize.
Okay. Alan Reese, can you take on Kelton's argument that the U.S. benefits from a surplus of goods and services, which is the logical corollary of its trade deficit?
Well, I think that it's because the example that Kelton gave was that her son, with the trading cards, if she can trade a lower card for getting a higher card, then that actually is a benefit.
Okay.
And we shouldn't be concerned about deficits in trade deficits because we're getting something of value. And the other corollary of that is, if we have sovereign currency, we can print as much money as we want, as long as there's productive capacity for that to cover it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
So is it that even though we have a deficit in terms of finance as we have a surplus in terms of stuff, as you would say, goods and services, presumably.
Yes, yes. The way that she might put it, or that, say, Warren Mosley might put it, is let's take China. You have all these factories in China producing goods and services that employ the labor of tens or hundreds of millions of people, and they do not get to consume goods and services. Those are sold to the United States, and in return, China gets a larger balance in its account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Okay. Yes. Explain why in a three-sector model of the economy, the sum of the financial balances of the three sectors must be zero. Michael Leroy, can you take on this question?
I'll pass on that, really. Thank you very much.
Okay. John Bongiovanni, can you take on this question? Explain why in a three-sector model of the economy, the sum of the financial balances of the three sectors must be zero.
Well, the idea behind that accounting norm, I think, is that axiomatically they have to equal zero because there is no value. It's just the relationship in terms of surpluses and deficits among the parts of the economy. Okay. So if they don't equal zero, the question would be who are we not counting, or what are we not counting, or something like that.
That's correct. This logically flows from the accounting identity that says that a flow of revenue from one sector to another, everything on the debit side of an accounting transaction has to be matched by an equal and opposite value on the credit side of a transaction. Yeah. This is actually an extension of the concept that we saw, I believe, last week, where we had a two-sector model of the economy, a government sector and a non-government sector, two buckets. And we said that in that sort of model, the sum of the balances of those two sectors had to be equal to zero, and this merely extends the concept to three sectors. That's since we could spend a whole session talking about the two-sector and three-sector model of this economy, and that would take us far afield. So I'm simply going to leave the discussion there and let you plunge into it on your second reading of the chapter.
Hey, Jim, can I just make one comment?
Yes.
To me, it's best described as a closed system where there's no leakage.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that's another way of looking at it. Leakage. I believe that Stephanie Kelton, not necessarily in this book, but elsewhere, uses a bathtub model of water flowing into the bathtub and water flowing out of the bathtub, draining out of the bathtub. There's a variety of metaphors that you can use to discuss this. Okay. And the discussion of the three-sector model, the three buckets, you would go to pages 132 and forward. Okay. What would the federal job guarantee entail, and what, according to Stephanie Kelton, would its benefits be? Let's see, who's next up? Tom Rossman, can you take that question?
Sure, I can take the question. I'm not sure if I can unmute. The full employment job guarantee program would be anyone who is able and willing to work would be provided with a job, and it would benefit society because it would keep people employed and income coming in So hypothetically, it would lessen the period of time for them to reintegrate into productive society.
Okay. Now, much like the concept of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, the job guarantee is a concept that Stephanie Kelton returns to in various chapters in this book. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a bit on the job guarantee in its relation to the subject matter of Chapter 5, which is, let's say, foreign trade?
I'm going to have to pass on that because I haven't gotten to Chapter 5 yet.
Oh, okay, okay. Anyone want to try that? Ruth Cano. Unmute.
I would say that in foreign trade, very often the jobs go overseas and labor is left high and dry. American labor is left high and dry. They don't have any jobs. And so now if they have a job guarantee that would pay them up, give them money, they wouldn't be so upset about the trade deficit and the jobs going overseas. It makes for stability in a country because people get really upset when they see their jobs going abroad.
Okay.
I would add that, yes, I think that's one part which is dealing with dissatisfaction of labor, let's say, but it's also good for the economy because we use resources that otherwise would not be used, and it's good for everyone, not just the people who are temporarily unemployed. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Given the labor shortage at this time and its impact on inflation, wouldn't the federal jobs guarantee cause some level of private sector not being able to fully employ people or to shift people quick enough from one to the other, as we've seen it sort of in the pandemic? Wouldn't those type of problems crop up?
You could turn that argument around and say this would be the ideal time to implement a federal jobs guarantee because the number of jobs that would have to be staffed in the federal job guarantee program would be smaller because the private sector would simply be able to offer higher wages than the job guarantee wage, which is in effect the minimum wage.
Yep.
So now would be, and I'm speaking somewhat hypothetically here, but it would certainly be easier to start a jobs guarantee program now than say January 2009 when unemployment was well over 10%.
The other advantage of the job guarantee program is it puts workers into new training positions, so they get retrained for other positions in the economy, maybe IT or something that they're not familiar with, and that it allows for a more productive society in the long run.
Yes, that is correct. Okay.
I had a question while you're on the jobs guarantee.
Okay.
Like right now, if we're instituted right now, I guess the poultry workers would make less because they're largely immigrants and they can't like complain. It's non-unionized. They can't complain because they don't want to get deported. So basically they might migrate into the jobs guarantee, but I don't know how that would work with immigrants because they might be too scared to do that. But, I mean, assuming they wouldn't be too scared to grab a government job and they wouldn't be barred from it, it would create a labor shortage in the poultry industry and they'd have to raise their wages.
Well, the job guarantees proposal that I've seen, which is largely the work of the person who I've cited previously, Pavlina Cherneva, who wrote the book, The Case for the Job Guarantee, basically says that most government benefits, like Social Security or unemployment benefits, that it would only be available to people who have legal status in the country. So,
okay,
we would, that of course leaves a tremendous number of social and economic issues. But then, as I've said, MMT does not have an answer for everything.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's move on.
There are two questions, James, from people.
Okay, but I want to at least, I don't want to get to those questions until we at least move through all of our existing questions for chapter 5.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. The next question is, in the historical period in which the gold standard was operating, why did that standard create a recessionary bias in countries with trade deficits? Let's see. The next person on my screen is Vicky. Are you there, Vicky? Okay, Vicky indicated to me previously that she might be busy during the session, so I'm going to move on. I'm going to pose that question to Geoffrey Balse. Geoffrey, are you there? Okay. Peter Lugton, can you tackle this question? In the period which the gold standard was operating, why did that standard create a recessionary bias in countries with trade deficits?
Historically, countries on a gold standard traded based on gold and needed gold reserves to cover the cost of imports, so they all wanted a trade surplus. Failing that, increased interest rates would make domestic life more expensive and hence less dollars for imports, and also would attract foreign money to gain interest, but it would create domestic economic slowdown, recessions, and extended unemployment.
Okay, very good, very good. And related to that is our next question. Discuss the likely impact on developing countries of the U.S. Federal Reserve's plans to raise interest rates over the next year. Bonnie, can you tackle that question?
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, let me look back at this question. Interest rates. Well, developing countries that either have their currency pegged to that are dollarized or that have been structurally readjusted in order to pay their debts in dollars, it's going to be more expensive for them to get those dollars. Because I guess if the U.S. raises interest rates, then that's really going to be very difficult for these developing countries to repay their debt, assuming they all have taken out loans from the IMF and the World Bank, which of course is what structural readjustment is all about.
Okay, very good, very good. Next question would be...
Can I interrupt for 1 sec?
Yeah.
Please? Just to get back to the gold thing, there was a book called France Gold in the Great Depression. And they pointed out that if countries demanded gold, they were running a surplus in trade, a country could end up shipping a lot of their gold out of the country. And yes, what they're really doing is shrinking the money supply. So they would even, some countries would even raise their interest rates to make it attractive for those countries to keep their money in, or their gold in the country, right? So I think part of the recessionary bias would stem from that cycle. And that's why Britain went off the gold standard when the Great Depression started and so forth, because of that dynamic. And I think the United States raised its interest rates at the beginning of the Great Depression for the same reason, trying to keep the gold in the country.
Yes, if you read the something about the economic history of the U.S. between, like, let's say 1928 and 1935, the international competition, things like interest rates, trade barriers, and so forth, where every country was trying to hoard gold, but all countries cannot hoard gold at the same point in time, and in particular, people would point out that before Britain went off the gold standard, it attempted to stay on it by raising interest rates. That pulled gold from the United States to Britain. That had a contractionary effect in the United States, led to depression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay. Near the end of this chapter, Stephanie Kelton says, trade is not about competition among countries, but about power relationships among specific interests within specific companies. Let's see, who's next up? Mario Cordero, can you discuss this argument that Stephanie Kelton puts forward? Okay, I don't know if Mario's there. Let's see. Neil H., can you discuss this argument that Stephanie puts forward? Try to explain it in your own terms, perhaps.
Well, I think it would mainly be would link to the trade deficit, trade surplus. There is, although we have a trade deficit, people get goods cheaper when they're getting them from China. So although manufacturing leaves America, those people lose jobs, whereas other people benefit from free trade if those goods are cheaper.
Okay, okay.
That would be the power balances within a country.
Yep, yep. Okay, and the final discussion question before we turn to the questions that have been raised in the chat window. What are some policies that developing countries can undertake which would increase their monetary sovereignty, and how would they benefit therefrom? Alana Hartsack, can you take a stab at that question? Alana?
Jim, Alana just joined the class.
Oh, okay.
I don't think she was aware of the rules of engagement.
Okay. Patricia Lowe, could you take on that question?
Yeah. Well, one is not, in the case of the U.S., is not to be so hung up on the deficit. Like, for example, the Social Security.
Okay, but this question is about developing countries.
Oh, I'm sorry, developing countries. To increase their monetary sovereignty. Well, they have to unpeg their currency to the dollar, to external currencies. I don't know if they could just do that. It depends on how much faith and confidence the citizens have in their own currency, and they're not hoarding dollars. So I guess they have to stop paying dollars to their citizens, like on demand. So that's the thing I think of that they could do, like do that overnight.
Okay. Anybody else like to mention ways in which developing countries might be able to increase their monetary sovereignty?
I have an idea.
Norman Scott.
She talks about South-South trade, I guess, meaning
that's right.
direct trade between developing countries. She talks about, I think that fundamentally developing countries are almost like as if they were treated like colonies in a sense, and that they're forced to produce goods that don't necessarily benefit their country. And I would think that a greater variety, I think she may have mentioned, of more control over what they produce would be another factor, and also limiting how people invest. Right now, it's like free market, limiting the ability of certain investors to take control of that economy and just limiting to what exactly they can do. I think at some point she mentioned that China has, doesn't just allow anyone to just come in and invest the way they want, which she attributes to some extent to China's growth and ability to resist some of the manipulations that often go on in these developing countries.
Okay, very good.
May I add something to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ibrahima.
One way they could do, the first thing I would say, because some don't have it, I would refer to the CFA zone fund that I'm sure you are very much aware of, the 14 countries in West Africa that basically operate on the system of currency where France basically run their monetary policy for them, prints the money, and then ship it to them. And whenever they want to buy something from those countries, they just print it and give them that money. So first of all, they have to get it so that they have full sovereignty. That's the second one would be whenever they have to borrow, they should borrow in the currency that they own, because now they are users of a currency that they don't own. So they need to really take care of that. But I think the biggest challenge for those countries is not just to have a sovereign currency. If you can have a sovereign currency, but if you don't have a sufficient production capacity, you will have to import things from outside. And the countries from where you are importing have to want to accept your currency before you could do so.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem. Like Russia these days decided to have everybody, whatever you want from Russia, to use rubles. Well, they were very happy to see that a lot of people are coming because they have stuff that other countries want. So they are willing to pay in ruble, and therefore they can issue their currency. But if the CFA countries decided, okay, we're gonna be only using our CFA, what are you offering the world that will make them willing to wanna accept your CFAs? That's the problem.
Right.
Yeah, so right. Monetary sovereignty would help solve the problem, but it's not a magic bullet. We gotta take care of the economy.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, some of the things that Stephanie Kelton mentions in this chapter are macroeconomic policies, but they're not strictly speaking monetary policies, such as she stresses the need for developing countries to become, to the greatest extent possible, food independent and energy independent. Let me now turn to the chat.
Can I ask you a question? Because she had an example of Mexico under NAFTA because they were forced to accept U.S. agricultural goods, and a lot of the immigrants were poor agricultural workers that were lost their jobs. I just wanted to raise that point. But Mexico didn't have much control of that, but they agreed to NAFTA. They got factory jobs, but traded agricultural jobs for that.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the participants window, and
can I butt in, because I grew up in a developing economy and I've seen how it suffered by abiding by the rules of the International Monetary Fund. I think one good move that a developing country does is really aspire to be outside the bounds of the International Monetary Fund, where it can impose certain policies on the economy. The second approach that I've seen that work is to trade with countries that are willing to accept their currency on the condition that the country also accepts the trading partner's currency.
Yes.
And that's exactly what China did. And when it applied that principle, trade simply flourished. And it destroyed the practical oligopolies of the dollar, the euro, and the yen. So there should be at least two major policies that I would recommend to the global south.
Yes, I believe this is part of what Stephanie Kelton refers to as South-South trade.
Yes,
and if you're particularly interested in that, there's an MMT scholar. His name is Fidel Kaboub. He's originally from Tunisia. He teaches at Denison University in Ohio, and you can find quite a few lectures by him on the internet, and you can go deeper into those issues.
How do you spell that?
I'll put it in the chat later.
All right.
The Slack channel later. Okay. We're now halfway through the meeting, so what I'd like to now do is to turn to chapter 6, You're Entitled. I suspect that the subject matter in this chapter will be a bit closer to home for many of us and a bit easier to get through than that in chapter 5. So I want to move into chapter 6. Once again, we're going to begin by asking you to explain certain terminology that Stephanie Kelton uses in chapter 6. And the first term that I'd like to have someone discuss is that of entitlement. What does, in her usage, does entitlement need? And I'd like to call upon Paul Lebo. Can you tell us what entitlement means? Paul Lebo. Okay, let's try someone else. Oliver Liu, can you discuss the term entitlement?
I didn't read that chapter, but I mean, just the generic definition is just something that a citizen of a country has a right to in terms of a payment or a service from the government.
Okay, okay. The next term is related to that, and that's earned entitlement. What is earned entitlement, particularly as distinct from entitlement? Alex Zucatos, can you discuss that?
No, I would have thought that entitlement and earned are opposites. So I don't know that I can explain that unless it's earned as a result of being a member of a particular country.
Okay. Ruth Cano, can you perhaps explain that distinction?
Yes, I think FDR wanted Social Security to receive consistent support from the American public. He was afraid people would say his program for social assistance was socialist. And so he had to make it sound like it was paid for or earned by working people. So he instituted a payroll tax, which it says is a federal insurance contribution act. And this tax went into a designated trust fund from which money to pay for entitlements should come. So people thought it had to be earned somehow. It
okay.
gave it, a status somehow.
Okay.
But isn't that the case, though, that it was the previous generation that paid into Social Security that you earned later?
Well, actually, Alec, you're anticipating. Alec, you're anticipating some of the discussion that we'll be getting to in just a couple minutes.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. The next term is dependency ratio. Özlem, can you tell us what dependency ratio is? Okay, let's put that question to Lucas. Can you explain what the term dependency ratio means?
Dependency ratio is just a simple formula, the number of workers versus the number of people receiving the particular benefit. Question the number of people working and those who qualify for, say, old age pension, that sort of thing.
Okay, okay. Yes, in particular, one of the things that comes up in discussions of the affordability or the maintainability of Social Security is the age dependency ratio. That is the number of people in the age brackets eligible to receive Social Security as a percentage of either the total population or in relation to the average working age population. The final term that I'm going to look for a definition is means testing. Marty Rowland, can you explain what means testing means?
Yeah, means testing is reducing or eliminating entitlement and benefits for people with higher incomes. The problem is that if you don't have the means testing, there's no need to define what the subset is. So, so the means testing is identifying, well, so I guess the idea behind means testing is that you should only give it to people who aren't earning high incomes. But that's not how they do it. The benefit is if you reach a certain age, you get Social Security.
Okay, so would you say that Social Security is a means-tested benefit?
No.
No.
That's okay. That's correct. Earlier was mentioned how during the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration established Social Security and so forth. But Social Security, unemployment benefits, they are established as earned entitlements. They're at least ideologically tied to one's experience in the workforce or past earnings. At the same time, the Roosevelt administration created another class of benefits that were means tested and that were basically stigmatized because you had to be poor in order to receive them. And the means testing is basically the question of, are you poor enough to get on welfare or something like that? So, so one type of benefits, the earned entitlements, enjoys a positive social value. Other has come to be associated with negative social connotations. Okay, so next question. Explain Kelton's contention that programs like Medicare and Medicaid will always be financially sustainable on the part of the U.S. federal government. What limitations might these programs face in the future? James Frederickson, can you tackle this question?
As I understand it, the pressure from people who say that these programs need to have funding may limit Congress's willingness to continue to fund them, even though the government should be able to fund them by just printing the money or just putting the money into circulation.
Okay.
In other words, it's there's an abbreviation she uses here called SMI, or Supplementary Medical Insurance, which she says is already funded through the ladder mechanism.
Yes.
The programs that Medicare and Medicaid are not funded that way, and people who say that we can't fund them unless we either raise taxes or get rid of other programs may impair the ability for those programs to continue to be viable in a lot of people's minds.
Okay, so there is a political impairment or a political obstacle.
Yes.
Okay, apart from that political obstacle, what limitations might these programs face in the future?
Not enough doctors.
I was looking to James. Do you want to continue that?
Well, I think that's a possible answer. I don't know specifically beyond that. However, what you're driving at.
Okay, Ruth.
It seems if the country doesn't invest in important development programs like further education for the population, and it doesn't develop the country's resources enough, it really won't be able to do all these things. It has to pay into education and transportation, improved infrastructure, and it would seem to me that the economy would just sink and be into recession. So.
Okay. Okay. Ed Dotson, do you want to elaborate any more on what you were saying?
Well, yeah, Ruth kind of hit on it, but obviously, if the population grows faster, then there are new doctors and nurses added to replace those who leave the practice by attrition or whatever. And plus, there's not the construction of medical facilities with everything that entails. Then those are limits on what these programs would face in order to serve the number of people that need to be served.
That's correct. It's a question of will the real human and material productive resources be available there in the future to provide the promised benefits. The point that Stephanie Kelton and that MMT more generally makes is that it's not a question of money to be able to fund these programs, but there are real questions about the resources available, partly because as the population shifts to an older population, that age dependency ratio means that to maintain the expected level of consumption, both of the working population and the retired population, that the working population has to have greater labor productivity. We have to produce more. But that's not a question of money. It's a question of real productive resources.
This is
yes.
And in other words, part of the answer to your question is also part of the answer to a subsequent question that you raised. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but you said Kelton argues that the discussion about programs like Social Security and Medicare needs to include three distinct issues. And you must be talking about the third of those issues, which is our economy's productive capacity.
Yes.
Which I didn't think of when you asked me the original question.
Yeah, well, we'll circle back.
I've got a comment.
One of the things I would just want to mention here is that it's worth your while to go to the internet, go to YouTube, and look for the video segment that Stephanie Kelton cites, the interchange between former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan and former House Speaker Paul Ryan. At that point in time, I believe he was the head of the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives, in which Paul Ryan was thinking that he was throwing Alan Greenspan a softball question designed to support Ryan's program for essentially cutting Social Security benefits because allegedly we would not be able to pay for them in the future. They would not be financially plausible. And Alan Greenspan said in response that no, financing them, making the payments is no obstacle. We can always create the money to create them. But will the real productive resources, the goods and services that, say people receiving Social Security benefits, will we be able to produce those such that they can be purchased with those Social Security benefits? And to my mind, that was the most forthright and honest statement that Alan Greenspan ever made as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Alan Reese, you had a question? And
yeah, I have just a comment. Couldn't we say that the massive rise in medical care and medical costs over the last 10 years is due to the lack of productivity that we have currently, not just in the future productivity?
Here I'm going to speak outside the scope of MMT. So this do not consider this to be an MMT answer, though it may be a Jim Keenan answer. And that is that partially we would expect that an affluent society and a society which is also aging is going to spend more of its total resources on healthcare. And in fact, we would probably want such a society to spend more of its resources on healthcare, because that's like the bonus for having a productive economy, that we get to support people and they get to live longer, or at least they did up until the past couple of years, when between drug addiction and COVID, our life expectancies in the United States have actually begun to shrink. But in terms of the price of healthcare, I think that reflects probably a lot more monopolization within the healthcare sector. The fact that the power of the pharmaceutical lobby prevents Congress from allowing the Social Security Administration to specifically Medicare to bargain over pharmaceutical prices, as is done for Medicaid. So it's much more a question of political and economic power that is determining the price of healthcare. And we certainly see that just when we compare ourselves to other countries of comparable economic productivity, but much lower cost in healthcare, such as Canada.
Or France.
Or I mean, basically pick anyone. You see that other countries get much better value for their health care than we do, and the explanation is not in the technology or in the resources available to these countries. It's the answers in the politics to those countries. Okay. Now here's a question that we actually are part of the answer to which we already touched upon. Why does Stephanie Kelton believe that certain decisions made by President Franklin D. Roosevelt when setting up Social Security in the 1930s now work to politically undermine the program? Michael Leroy, can you tackle that question?
Well, I would have done, but I've just been reading about that, and I probably disapprove of everything President Roosevelt was doing at that time. That green agenda. I think it was terribly distorted and whatever. But so it's a historical question for you lot. I think as Americans, I'd rather stick to the England, United Kingdom scenario, which is similar actually. The socialists in setting up the health service and all that had great aspirations, etc., etc., etc. But now it's grown so large that it's creaking at the seams, and the cost of we're almost going to get good health care in this country. You're going to have to pay for it yourself, because the health service is so overrun. There's 6 million people who can't get ordinary procedures done because of the so-called workload, etc., etc., etc. So unless you've got private resources, just whistle. You can't even get you just can't even get a doctor's appointment. You have to get you get a Zoom presentation or on the phone, and so they don't even know who you are anymore.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off there because this question was specific to the United States.
Yeah, I know.
Joe Bongiovanni, can you tackle that question?
Say that question again.
Okay. Why does Stephanie Kelton believe that certain decisions made by President Roosevelt when setting up Social Security in the 1930s now work to politically undermine that program?
Well, when it was set up, it was kind of set up as a contributions-based, benefit program, and the implication was that it could easily run, or that design could easily run out of money at some point in the future.
Yeah.
And right now, today, the people that are the Peterson groups running all their scenarios about how many trillions of dollars we're short with the Social Security Fund is in keeping with that perspective of what it's really all about. Whereas, as she says, it could be easily fixed by one change in the law, and
Yes.
we could end that political discussion.
Yes, very good, very good. Okay. Related question: explain Kelton's distinction between the U.S. federal government's financial ability to pay Social Security benefits and its legal authority to pay such benefits. Tom Rossman, can you tackle that question?
Well, there's unlimited ability to pay for it, and by statute, they're legally obligated to make those payments, even though they can change the formula as they've done several times.
Okay.
So unless the legislature changes the law or adopts a new formula, they have to pay it. And because deficits don't matter, they can pay as much as they want.
Okay. Okay. And the final discussion question for Chapter 6, Kelton argues that the discussion about programs like Social Security and Medicare need to include 3 distinct issues. What are those 3 issues? Vicky, are you there? Can you take that question? Okay, I guess Vicky is still away from the screen. Let's see. Joffrey, can you identify the 3 distinct issues that Stephanie Kelton feels are important about discussion of Social Security and Medicare?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that one. Sorry.
Okay.
Excuse me, I'll go. Can you hear
Vicky.
me?
Yes,
now
I can. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm driving down the street. Priorities, I think, and values, and our priorities, our values, and our I guess it would be capacity to like provide or care for the people in our, our people, our residents. Is that anywhere near right?
I would say you've identified 2 of the 3 issues, and I'll admit that the way that Stephanie Kelton prints them in the book, it may seem that there were 2 issues rather than 3, so it can be a bit tricky. But she says we first have to decide our priorities, and as you, Vicky, mentioned, to decide our priorities, we have to decide our values. And then she says we have to decide how we can achieve those priorities. And there's one other thing that issue that she said that we have to discuss, and I'm wondering if anyone can identify that 3rd consideration.
Well, it's the
Marty.
Yeah, the legal authority to pay so you don't have to keep on reauthorizing.
Okay. Okay. There's one other consideration that is a bit more of an economic consideration as distinct from a strictly political consideration. Can anybody identify that?
About the productive capacity, that's already been discussed.
Yeah. Okay. Specifically, do we have the productive capacity to produce do we have the real productive resources to produce the things purchased by Social Security recipients or purchased in the course of providing health care? Do we have the productive capacity to produce those without running up against an inflation barrier? And as we've seen in the past year, the answer may be that despite having a very productive economy, there are parts of the economy that are out of alignment with one another, and that where we actually have a supply side problem that can result in inflationary pressures.
I got a question on the inflationary barrier. Nobody's looking at the public health. Like, this country's not too good with public health, and basic research into diet, like all the research into diet is like mostly by people who are self-interested, and they pay universities to find what they're trying to push. So, but medical research, NIH research done in the 70s in conjunction with China showed that in ethnically similar Han Chinese, the rural population were doing better than the urban ones which ate meat. And they found that in the Philippines too, regarding aflatoxins and getting cancer from the moldy peanuts. The city kids had the tumor promoter of too much dairy and meat. They were getting liver cancer, and the rural kids that didn't have meat because they couldn't afford it were not. And these are studies that were done when the NIH was interested in funding such studies. And now it's just every man for himself. And the sad American diet, standard American diet, sad. Everybody eats too much sugar, salt, and fat, and everybody's obese, or most are. And obesity correlates with inflammation and cancer and all that.
Well, okay.
Regulatory capture.
And if they don't do that, and if they do not do that to address the dietary causes, they are just going to have a sick population and make too many demands on the health system.
Okay, the issues that you're raising are important issues, but I'd have to say that they're outside the scope of modern money theory to address.
You pay some of these workers that are unemployed, you pay them to participate in studies so they can match them up with controls, and you'll have thousands of people enrolled in the prospective studies like the ones that were done in China, where they controlled for communicable diseases. They didn't count the people that died from tuberculosis, but the people that lived long, they didn't have high blood pressure and heart disease and all that. So you get an army of volunteers genetically similar. You have a big enough army of volunteers, you can do a lot of controlled studies, prospective.
Okay. Much to my surprise, though, we had two chapters to cover in Stephanie Kelton's book tonight. We actually got through the discussion questions, and we have 17 minutes left to spare. So at this point, I'm going to basically open the floor, but by asking people to raise their hand in the participants window. If you have a question on either tonight's material or the material that we've come so far, we want, I see. Yeah. We want the discussion to be on topic for MMT in some way. So let's see. Bonnie, I see your hand raised in the participants.
Yes. A general question. Does she in this book ever discuss the role specifically of the private Federal Reserve Central Bank as opposed to, say, the US government Treasury acting as a central bank? Does she ever get into that? It seems like she sort of doesn't deal with that, and what the differences would be in terms of national sovereignty if we didn't have a private central bank.
Well, I would say that the position of MMT is that we do not have a private central bank. The Federal Reserve is part of the government. The analysis of MMT is that the banking system as a whole is what might be described as a public-private franchise. That is, banks and financial institutions are private, but they basically have to be chartered by the government in order to operate. Hence, and the Federal Reserve System was originally set up, at least with the veneer of being a public-private franchise. But of course, the Central Federal Reserve Board in Washington is part of the federal government. It's not part of a cabinet department like the Treasury, but nonetheless, you will find, if you go on to read in the advanced MMT literature, that it pays a tremendous amount of attention to the daily cooperation in operations between the federal government and the U.S. Treasury, that basically they're joined at the hip. Maybe Stephanie doesn't concentrate that much on this book, but if you read other books on MMT, such as the macroeconomics textbooks or books by Randall Wray, which we can provide links to, you would see that those are well discussed there.
Yeah.
Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I can see that. I'm just, it's interesting though that the Federal Reserve has hired BlackRock to disperse the CARES money. It's all, well, anyway, I guess this is more than another discussion, I guess, but it's sort of has a facade of a public facility, but excuse me.
I mean, it's a capitalist state, so no one is denying that the orientation of the Federal Reserve is going to be toward the capitalist class, and particularly to the financial sector of the capitalist class. But it's nonetheless it's a public institution. James Frederickson, I see your hand raised.
Thank you. There are two questions that I would like to ask, if possible. The first one is there a difference between the job guarantee that Ms. Kelton, Dr. Kelton, wants to institute and workfare?
Yes. The job guarantee would be universally available, and it would be a voluntary program. If you participated in the program, you would work and you would get paid the job guarantee wage, and it would be specifically designed as a floor to the labor market. Workfare basically says that we're basically going to stigmatize you and give you welfare benefits only if you perform these, enroll in this particular work program. So the idea, there's a real political and ideological difference between the job guarantee and workfare, in that the job guarantee is designed to be a program that has equally as much social prestige, we might say, as unemployment compensation, and is not stigmatized as welfare is.
Okay. The other question is, could you elaborate a little bit more on how devaluation that attacks labor comprises structural reform?
Okay, well, you have to, I would say, first of all, you have to understand that when Stephanie Kelton mentions this term structural reform, she's using, if I might be so bold as to say, she's using the enemy's term, right? She's saying that the orthodox economists use this term structural reform because it sounds nice. I mean, who can object to reform? And, who can fail to disagree with that we could need some improvements in the structure of a system, or particularly that a third world country would need improvements, reforms in its structure. But she says that it's basically a euphemism for trying to force an underdeveloped country to adopt social policies that basically mandate a transfer of income from the working classes of such a country first to the rich classes of those countries, and then from the rich classes of those countries to the financial sectors of the advanced countries. So that in effect, if a country has had no choice but to borrow in currencies other than its own, currencies that it itself does not issue, and that basically means taking out loans from Citibank or Chase or whatever, and taking out loans from the denominated in dollars from the IMF, that those countries, in order to pay back those loans, have to accumulate dollars. That means they have to emphasize production of goods and services that can be exported and sold in dollars, and and basically immiseration of the local population.
So you pay laborers low wages so that the goods will be attractive to the more well-off countries to whom they're being sold?
Yes. And I would say this is not particularly or exclusively an MMT insight. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school 40 years ago in the mid-1970s, one of the hot books that came out was called The Debt Trap, the IMF and the Third World or something like this. And I forget the author's name. Is a woman whose first name was Cheryl. But it was like, in like 1976 or 77, this was the hot book on international trade in that year. And she, this woman, Cheryl, went through discussion of the policies of the IMF and how they impoverished third world countries. And that has basically continued unchanged to the present day. MMT adds to that discussion the insight of the importance of monetary sovereignty, but it's not something that is particular to MMT.
Thank you.
Okay. Alan Reese, you have a hand raised. Alan Reese, unmute. Alan Reese, you're muted.
Sorry, one of the things what Stephanie mentioned, that during World War I and World War II, they went off the gold standard.
Yes.
And then they went straight to MMT to print enough money to finance the war. But one of the things that happened was that the production was going to war goods. So the consumers didn't have anything to buy. So there was no inflation, though, until after the war. But I think the inflation during the war was handled by rationing and by wage and price controls. And I actually seen some of the ration cards that my father had during World War II. And then after the war, they took the lid off, and then right after that, in the late 40s, inflation peaked.
Yes.
Because there weren't any consumer goods to purchase, because everything had to be retooled for consumer goods.
Yes, yes. The only thing I would add to that is that there was rationing, and you had ration cards, and there were also wage and price controls. But there are two other factors that have to be mentioned. One is that because if you think about it, the consumers who were basically people working in the defense industries and who were getting much higher wages than they were during the Depression, because of the Depression they were unemployed and not getting wages. So they had all this money to spend, but as you point out, there were no consumer goods to spend them on. Automobile production having been suspended 2 months after Pearl Harbor, for instance. And so basically, one of the steps that the government took two other steps to drain the money that they were spending into the economy via war production wages, to drain that money back out of the economy. And one of them was higher taxation. It was during World War II that withholding of taxes from paychecks was first implemented. As a matter of fact, the famous right-wing economist Milton Friedman worked on the withholding programs during World War II. And the other thing was the emphasis on war bond sales, because basically what was happening, although they were marketed as help pay for the war, help invest in your country's war effort, what the war bond sales were actually doing was draining spending power out of the economy, giving people in return a safe interest-bearing asset that they could cash in after the war, when presumably production of consumer goods would resume. One thing that some of you may be interested in is, again, going to YouTube, enter in the YouTube search bar, enter the phrase Betty Davis war bonds, and you will see, you will be taken to what we would now call videos that were actually newsreel productions that the Hollywood stars recorded during World War II to encourage people to buy war bonds. And war bonds, in effect, were deferred consumption. And you can go and you can watch the videos. I particularly recommend videos with Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, because, of course, they were rivals and they were competing. And the Warner Brothers studio and Warner Brothers stars, such as Betty Davis, were the most competitive in terms of war bond sales. And it's very interesting. Of course, they didn't have monetary to explain that, what we're really doing is we're draining money out of the economy because you don't have the consumer goods currently available to spend your defense industry paychecks on, but we're giving you deferred, we're allowing you to defer that consumption until after the war. I also recommend, if once you've finished watching Betty Davis, you should go and read the Levy Institute working paper that I've mentioned previously by Yeva Nersessian and Randall Wray, called How to Pay for the Green New Deal, which discusses the World War II experience, is based in John Maynard Keynes's World War II pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, and which discusses how in the future we would approach a national mobilization to fight climate change and in the same way.
Oh, that's nice.
Was there inflation during World War II?
Yes, there was, but surprisingly little. As a matter of fact, just the other day, I was reading a paper that discusses the stages in the World War II economy, the management of the World War II economy, and pointed out that at the very start of the war, they began to implement wage and price controls. In fact, those actually began to be implemented even before Pearl Harbor, but that there was an exception carved out for the agricultural sector. And instead, in the agricultural sector, they were saying, well, we're going to implement this program called parity pricing, and we're going to guarantee the farmers parity pricing at 110% of the 1910 farm prices. That proved to be a colossal failure in terms of the rest of the economy, because it meant that the prices of food, the most basic consumption good, were being pressed up at the same time that wages were being held constant. And so the inflationary prices were actually stronger in, like, say, 1942 and early 1943 because of this adoption of parity. And once the Roosevelt administration changed its policy to control agricultural prices as well, inflation was really very moderate during World War II, especially as compared to World War I.
Leslie, couldn't wage and price controls be enabled right now to control the cost of oil and and the other things that are racing in the economy?
Well, it's theoretically possible, but it's not necessarily what either I or MMT or Stephanie Kelton would recommend as a first choice, because it would require a political consensus on the level of such that we had after Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Lugton, you had a hand raised.
Yeah, I was.
And this is, let me just say, this is going to have to be our last question because we're up against our time barrier.
All right. I was reading in the paper, with inflation soaring, Federal Reserve rushes to make up for early missteps. And there's a paragraph here, even so, the delay could come with consequences. By the time the Fed completely stopped buying bonds and began raising rates in March, prices were rising 8.5% from a year earlier. What does that mean when it says the Fed completely stopped buying bonds? Who were they buying them from before, and why was buying bonds the thing that they were doing?
Well, that was the Fed's program called quantitative easing, which it actually began to implement way back in around 2009 as a response to the great financial crisis. And the idea, which MMT would probably disagree with, the Fed was acting on the notion that if they flooded the financial sector with liquidity by buying either treasury bonds or other financial assets held by private banks, and basically increasing bank reserves, that the banks would then lend and revive the economy. Now, we would probably need one or two sessions of a course like this just to discuss the great financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's response to that, and the MMT critique thereof. So we really can't get into it now, but there's, certainly a lot of resources that I could recommend to you for a discussion of that question. Okay, I see that we're past our timeline, and so we're going to have to close off now. Next week is our last week. The reading is chapters 7 and 8 of Stephanie Kelton's book, and here we really are shifting to the discussion of the policy implications of MMT and how they're related to the values that one holds. So please try to work through those discussion questions so that we can move rapidly through them, you understand them, and then we can have some final wrap-up discussion from this course.
Can I ask one question, please, James? Is next week's session a bit later? Because I believe it's 8 o'clock your time, and that means 1:30 in the morning here for me.
No, I don't really know what you're referring to, because all the questions are at the same, all the sessions are at the same time.
Okay,
that's 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We're all, and I don't really know whether we are at this point 4 or 5 hours off from the United Kingdom.
To give you some idea, you're at 6:30, and that means 11:30 here, and it's now 1:30 in London now.
Oh,
5 hours or so. But if it starts a bit later next week, it means I have to start.
No, we're not starting later next week. We are starting at exactly the same time, 6:30 p.m. New York time. Make your calculation on that basis.
Oh, that's fine. That's okay.
It's not going to be later. Okay. See you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. And see you. Some of you are already taking the public banking class, so I'm hoping to see you on Wednesday. Thank you.